Happy Monday, everybody. For those unfamiliar, this is Psychedelic States of America's Monday News Roundup. I'm your host, Jack Gorsline. I'm an investigative reporter and founder of Psychedelic States of America and the Psychedelic Writers Guild. Uh, Pumped to be joined by generous co-host Joe Moore, founder of Psychedelics Today. Joe, how's it going this morning? This
Lovely.
afternoon?
Excited to be here.
Yeah, we got a lot of good stuff to cover. No shortage of updates on policy across the U.S. I saw through our pals over at Psychedelic Alpha, there's been 106 bills filed across the country at across a number of states related to psychedelics. Again, another record. I think it's just going to keep going up year by year, but some really exciting and definitive action. Um, in that two major bills were just signed into law. Joe, tell us a little bit about what's going on in Utah.
Yeah, I was able to put together an article late last week after the governor signed their bill into law. It looks like a bipartisan effort, international effort. I'm going to read a quote from some of the team here. HB 390 is about responsible governance and veteran care. States across the nation have recognized that we can't wait for federal action while our veterans continue to suffer. The passage of this bipartisan bill reflects Utah values, evidence-based decision-making, fiscal responsibility, and unwavering support for those who served. That was Representative Jennifer Daly Provost, also a PhD, which, more PhDs in government, please. And then a new friend here, Anya, actually pointed out that this bill was supported by both three different veterans groups: VETS, Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, Heroic Hearts Project, and Veteran Mental Health Leadership Coalition. So that's quite interesting. I think there's a lot that's going to happen there. I think it's largely a research bill. So we're not going to see anything on the scope and scale of Oregon. But I think a lot of states are wanting to just start investing here to show that, hey, we're being cautious, but at the same time, we're also hopeful.
Yeah, I think in states that lean conservative, across basically every area of government except the occasional city, we're going to see a prioritization of research bills first. And task forces where bills start. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Task forces are, they're nice, they're flashy, they get some good press. Sometimes those recommendations are really thoughtful. Minnesota's task force report was really thoughtful. Maryland's task force report was really, really thoughtful and had some really innovative concepts woven into it. But unless there's really been some extended stalling year by year, it is flashy and in substance in terms of recommendations, but whether or not it advances, it's really an opportunity to educate people. And I think research is a step further, right, in some of these conservative states. And we've seen, for example, Mississippi, the governor last week signed into law an ibogaine focused research bill, keeping the momentum going as far as the sweeping expansion of ibogaine research across the southeast United States. So, and in other conservative
This actually
states, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
mirrors international stuff too. With years ago, I was chatting with a number of researchers in Ukraine, and they were very interested in rolling out ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and we were kind of more interested in helping them figure out mushroom psychotherapy, given the amount of trauma there. And they were actually having similar conversations. Let's actually at least do one pilot study here before we roll it out, just because we want to prove that it works in our population with our own researchers.
Yeah,
And
and
it
some
seems appropriately cautious in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and we're seeing a number of pilot program bills, even if we talked a little bit with Victor Costanza from Connecticut for accessible psychedelic medicine a couple of weeks back, about how their pilot program never really got any appropriations funding from the state of Connecticut formally, but they were able to pass a bill that's advancing its way through the state house that would essentially expand the framework of that pilot program to a statewide, regulated access program, which would be a huge step forward for a state like Connecticut. Not that it is everything that grassroots advocates are looking for. I know they're particularly keen, as many are, on weaving in, decriminalization provisions and a broader, less medicalized framework for access at some point. But the innovation that we're seeing at the state level, as far as how policy is being crafted with future advancements in mind, as public opinion sways further and further in support of increased access, is something to really keep an eye on. And as I reported a couple of weeks ago now, I guess early last week, New Mexico, as a good place to tie up our state roundup. New Mexico was able to secure funding over $500,000, $630,000 towards their state psilocybin treatment equity fund to fund financially affordable psilocybin treatment through their medical program for low income residents, as well as an additional $300,000 towards end of life anxiety research at the University of New Mexico. What is fascinating is that treatment fund didn't have any funding appropriated towards it when the state budget was first introduced earlier this year as first proposed. And, as we've seen in some other states, a diverse coalition of grassroots advocates, including representatives from groups like Heroic Hearts Project and the Healing Advocacy Fund, controversial in some states and spaces as they may be, got together with every advocacy organization across the space in New Mexico and made a concerted effort to push for the inclusion of said funding, and it worked. New Mexico's got, I would encourage people to read my coverage because we don't have time to dig into where that funding came from. But it is interesting how New Mexico's particular, bureaucratic setup led to this breakthrough and providing that funding vis-a-vis, state managed public trust of oil reserves. So, Joe, one more thing I want us to touch on, and then we'll bring on Steph Carzon Abrams, is South Dakota, where we saw a Compass Pathways friendly, let's put it that way, psilocybin, crystal polymorph psilocybin trigger bill signed into law by the South Dakota governor. What can you tell us about the specifics of this and whether or not it might lead to a domino effect elsewhere?
Well, this is interesting, and I love that it's in the Dakotas to start. So, generally, when a drug gets approved by the FDA and it's already scheduled, like it's a scheduled compound at the DEA, there needs to be a descheduling thing that happens at states because the states typically automatically adopt new scheduled compounds from DEA. This will be with Compass Pathways the first time in history a drug comes across the finish line and the DEA lowers the schedule status on that drug. And that means that states then have to actually manually remove these from legislation. So I think there's action right now in Colorado on this. I think it's in a number of other states, but it's very interesting that the Dakotas went first. It makes me wonder about what the lobbying effort actually looks like to make this happen, because this isn't an inexpensive activity. This is
Yeah.
why actually scheduling drugs is actually harmful to the new drug development pipeline. We want to be really careful with this new excitement at the DEA around new drugs getting scheduled, because we have to do all of this all over again.
Yeah, would highly recommend folks checking out Double Blind Magazine's Mary Carrion's recent coverage on the advancement of some Compass Pathways friendly bills in a number of states. I believe a similar version of this bill, or the exact same version, is awaiting the signature or potential veto of West Virginia's governor, and will likely see advancement of it elsewhere. It fell flat in Iowa, Kansas, and Virginia last year, and notably similar, like broader language breakthrough therapies trigger bills were then filed in those states, which would again give the first FDA approved psychedelic compound, a fast track in said state, even if the language is broader. So I'm definitely curious to dig into Compass Pathways lobbying activity at, states across the union, and stay tuned for sure, as I know there's some great coverage coming in the works across the independent psychedelic media. All that said, we will circle back on some interesting developments at the federal level per my reporting last week, but we are thrilled to be joined today by Steph Carzon Abrams, I think one of the world's foremost leading authorities at the intersection of psychedelics and women's health. I'm sure she's going to say, she's very modest, that is a bit grandiose, but I do think that it tracks. Steph, thanks for joining us today. Might be having some, not sure that we can hear you.
Not yet. Yeah. But Steph is also involved at the Microdosing Collective, a number of other organizations. I think we have your audio now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
yes, that was a grandiose intro, but I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. So A lot of exciting stuff to talk about. I know you've been involved in a few different projects. We'll circle back on the microdosing collective, but give folks a little bit of an overview of your background and the work that you're doing with Beyond Consulting right now.
Sure. So Beyond Consulting essentially supports the very many visionary organizations in the psychedelic and integrative medicine space. That's been looking like a lot of medicine centers, building out clinics across the country, in Canada, and hopefully soon in Europe as well. We've supported also with a lot of research, decentralizing research for plant medicine companies and brands. And most recently, we launched Galilea, which is a women's health initiative. We're approaching women's health from all sides, inclusive of all modalities, but with a psychedelic lens, because we believe, as I'm sure you a lot of you know, that psychedelics are uniquely positioned to support women's health. And even if practitioners don't necessarily want to practice with psychedelics, they should certainly know about them so that they can fully support their patients and their clients. And so Galilea is, on one hand, community focused, education focused, bringing women providers, researchers, organization leaders, really anyone who's caring for women into our fold to provide networking and information. You can expect virtual and in-person meetings to be scheduled soon. And on the other hand, we also have a sub-consultation group within Beyond Consulting that's led by women. We're B2B, and we're here to help practices and centers really improve their women's health offerings and build out women's health programs.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, Steph, we've talked at length, privately about the importance of the work that you're doing. And I know we were able to touch base and quote you prominently in a feature that I did about next gen thinking for training and ethical care in psychedelics for Double Blind Magazine a couple of months ago. But what I think is so important about this, to highlight one specific thing, is that there are so many phenomenal guides in the underground that might be tapped into the way that these kinds of modalities can be woven into women's healthcare. But the gap in access to that knowledge within traditional structures of healthcare in the US in particular is just so vast. And there's going to be this big boondoggle and gap in education while we scale care in a post FDA approval landscape. And even now, as ketamine therapy, explodes in prescription relevance and prominence across the US in particular. So take us inside what the protocol actually looks like. What are some of the key factors involved in Galilea's approach that you're bringing to the front lines of healthcare with your partners?
Yeah, and you called it out, like in our healthcare system right now, we have different specialists, and it pretty much is every specialist kind of working within their silo of care. There isn't a lot of collaboration, though we've seen that this integrative group care model is becoming more popular and people are definitely asking for it. So it's a really interesting time where I think women are asking for better care. They're asking harder questions. They want teams and not just a specialist here, a specialist there, and having to kind of navigate and be the liaison between those healthcare providers. And the other thing that I think is difficult is that when you're a specialist, you're really focused on your specialty. And it's difficult at times to go outside of that scope of practice to receive knowledge about emerging therapies like psychedelics. So Galilea is really positioning itself to be that conduit and that liaison. If we can bring the information, the reliable education sources, and the people directly to those providers so that they have the tools and the resources to have conversations with their patients, and not shut those conversations down, which is what happens a lot at this moment in time. Physicians don't want to, speak out of turn. They don't want to break laws. They don't want to compromise their license. But I think there are certainly ways to have the conversation, to point to education, and even make referrals within the legal accessible system that we have. Because as much as we get really excited about the plant medicines that are coming down the pipeline, we have an incredible, powerful legal medicine that we can work with. And in order to make those referrals, you have to have very trusting relationships with the providers who offer it. So first and foremost, we want to be that liaison. We want to be that guide. I love, bringing other providers in psychedelic medicine into our fold, but I think our mission is beyond that, going outside of the bubble and speaking to the providers who, aren't in the choir just yet. So that's a big piece of it. Everybody involved at this point in our core group is in clinical practice and has had a lot of experience with plant medicine, caring for women, as well as working with psychedelic medicines. And so a big piece of what we're going to be doing is developing tools for practitioners to offer their patients, whether that is a more robust intake form that has women's focused questions, whether it's understanding how to offer care that is psychedelic aware and life stage aware, because that's how we should be offering care to women. And that's not just for psychedelics, but there's certainly an opportunity for psychedelics here. And just really working with providers to build out offerings that are women focused. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We're going to be starting webinars and writing some guides. All of these will be open access. And in the future, hopefully near future, we'll have some in-person retreats where we can teach some of these methods.
Incredible. We'll circle back to your recent expansion into Louisiana in a bit, but I do want to make sure that we talk about the course that you're offering with Unlimited Sciences. Can you tell us a little bit about why this course matters and why not only women but psychedelic practitioners across the space might want to sign up?
Yeah, this course is essentially addressing pretty much everything that we've spoken to thus far. I think many clinicians want to know the science behind how psychedelics work, particularly with a female's biology. And so we dive into those mechanisms. We dive into pharmacology. We talk about hormones. The beginning is very science based, and then we move into more relational practice. So, how do you work with women? What are the tools that you can incorporate into your practice? How do you also encourage hormone tracking and cycle literacy in your female patients? Because we are standing at this really interesting time where people are waking up to the fact that there have been shortcomings in medicine when it comes to female health and hormones. There's a big shift happening with midlife and menopause care. And so this course kind of bridges all of that. It kind of looks at the past research, current research, where the landscape is going, what are opportunities that are presenting themselves, what are the medicines that could work really well depending on what the concern or chief complaint is. And then finally, we really talk about the psychospiritual and existential dimensions of health that are often left out of our traditional Western healthcare system. And again, this kind of circles back to the fact that psychedelic therapies are uniquely positioned to address those dimensions of health. And certainly a woman moving through different life phases is undergoing big identity shifts. And it's my belief that just regular prescription mental health drugs are not supportive with those identity shifts. And so this is really about how to create that conversation with providers, between providers, and then supporting them and also having those conversations with their patients. So it's a really nice introductory course that hopefully turns on a lot of the scientific community and the medical community.
Yeah, and to your point, there was a study that was published, I believe, a week or two ago, basically, making the conclusion that psychedelic therapy might not be any more effective than SSRIs. I'm sure all three of us have some strong opinions on why that's not, really an accurate framing of the
No,
comparison.
that
But
headline's
all
got
of what yeah, and all of what you just laid out, and specifically that note about how psychedelics are uniquely positioned to address some of these forgotten areas of healthcare. We're looking to innovate, and so the efficacy might not match up on the same scale as, say, that of like a traditional SSRI might be measured, but there are innumerable ways in which the integration of psychedelic and plant medicine into traditional Western healthcare, systems of administration, if you will, is going to be very different, regardless of how the medicine's outcomes are measured. So that said, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in Louisiana. It's a state that has had some interesting conversations surrounding psychedelic policy. And I think we often forget, those of us above the Mason-Dixon, how important normalization of ketamine-assisted therapy is in normalizing psychedelics in the South. So tell us a little about
Yeah.
what you're working on.
Thanks for asking. Yes, there's a group out there, fantastic group of providers, and they've founded a clinic called Evergood, which is an integrative health and mental health clinic offering ketamine-assisted therapy. I've been working with them since last year to get their clinic up and running. We're almost there. It is very exciting. It's an exciting time because I feel like the South is really reframing and reshaping mental health, the stigmas involved. And I think it's extremely important for a state that has gone through a lot. Um, the community needs that type of support. It's very clear that the tools that are available right now within the system that currently exists is falling extremely short. And so I think they're just at a point where they've realized we don't have a choice but to open up, our acceptance of these medicines and try to understand them. And it really is about, positioning and language. And I think when you're approaching a community of people that tends to be a little bit more conservative or has reservations about psychedelics in general, it really starts with education. So this clinic is going above and beyond to educate the provider community. They're very important. Speaking to therapists, hosting educational events, and even working with a senator. There's a senator out there, I believe it is Senator McNath, who has pushed forward a task force to offer psilocybin therapy to veterans. LSU also has opened up some funding for psilocybin research. So we're really at an interesting point in time. And from a cultural perspective, it is very interesting because of the history of Louisiana and just how they view where spirituality and old folk stories and religion, like where all of that converges, and where does that leave psychedelics in that conversation. So I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, Louisiana notoriously, and I'd highly recommend folks check out Matha Busby wrote a really fantastic article for Vice about this. But Louisiana has some pretty strict plant medicine laws in general. It's one of the only states in the union that's, I think, the only state in the union that's banned Amanita muscaria and a number of others. And it just seems that there was like one very conservative state, senator a number of years ago that just made it his personal mission to get all the stuff that nobody was paying attention to banned. But that's, again, as I mentioned, I've seen it in Texas. Ketamine-assisted therapy has really helped normalize the conversation and has been a gateway into people in the South opening their minds to these substances as therapy and as medicine. So we're gonna move on here in a second, but I do want to close with a quick plug for the Microdosing Collective. What is on the docket for the Microdosing Collective in the weeks ahead, and how can folks learn more about what you guys are up to?
We're doing a lot right now. It's very exciting. As you might know, we have regular monthly webinars, and I think the programming's been really fantastic. So we're continuing with those and hosting those monthly. We are working on some policy efforts in New York at this moment. Really interesting bill in support of psilocybin for individuals suffering from cluster headaches. And I think that's really important work. This is a community of people who are really saving their own lives by going around and below and above the system to access some of these medicines. And I think it would be very important to create a pathway for legal access. We are also starting to put together a working group. A working group that's going to be focused on everything low dose. The conversation is very macro focused, and obviously, culturally speaking, there's a lot of conversation and buzz around microdosing. I think the micro to low dose for clinical applications is really interesting for women's health, for post-concussive syndrome, for headaches and chronic headaches. We're seeing that there's almost this like next wave of clinical applications within psychedelic therapy that are maybe in this kind of like low to medium dose, whether those are like maintenance therapy protocols, post macro, or maybe just going straight to these low to medium dose. And I know that, Joe, with your work with the Psychedelic and Pain Association, I'm sure that you guys are also kind of exploring how people are finding success with those lower doses. So I think that's what we're going to be seeing. Like, of course, our classic psychiatry applications are extremely important and will remain so, but there are all of these other indications that also share comorbidities with mental health. And I do think that this kind of low to medium dose is going to be really important here. So we'll be starting a working group, and we're hoping to gather researchers and scientists across the globe who are investing in studying these doses and these applications. So look out for that announcement. It's coming.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Looks like we should
Amazing.
partner with you on some of that. That's
We
great.
should definitely chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely. Well, Steph, Joe, any closing thoughts for Steph? Any closing questions?
No, just I used low to medium psychedelic dosing for my brain injury as well, and for my chronic pain condition. So seconded.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Even though I
And
made
big-
fun of it, it's real. And there's good data, and
Yeah.
it's worth leaning into further.
We just closed our recruitment for our headache survey. We had a chronic headache survey we were recruiting for all of pretty much last year, and we're getting down to now analyzing the data. So stay tuned on what we find there as well.
Amazing. We'll certainly be ready on standby to cover it. Steph, thank you so much as always.
Thanks for having
We'll talk
me.
soon, I'm sure. Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
All right. Okay, we're coming up on time, but never a bad idea to go a few minutes over, especially as it pertains to a congressional lobbying scandal, if you will. So, Joe, you may
I've
have
never
seen
heard of a
think
scandal
read.
before, Jack. There's a scandal right now.
Man, just look at the state of American politics at large.
Mhm.
Throw a stone and you'll hit any number of scandals, not pertaining to psychedelics in particular. But for
So
those who
you've done a lot of
Sorry,
work on this one, Jack. And like, what are the allegations against Kirsten Sinema and the Association for Prescription
Prescription
Psychedelics, who I think former Congressman Mimi Walters is doing a lot of work with?
Yes. So, obviously, shameless plug, and highly recommend checking out my Friday feature for Double Blind Magazine last week, which details at length the two separate complaints that have been filed, both with the Office of Congressional Conduct as well as the DOJ, about the former being specifically about former Congresswoman Mimi Walters of California and the organization that she is a board member of called the Association for Prescription Psychedelics, and the latter being a Department of Justice complaint involving one Kirsten Sinema, former Arizona senator, Democrat turned independent / pseudo-conservative lightning rod, and avowed ally of the Ibogaine lobby. So to give the most efficient summary that I can possibly give, the first complaint with the OCC involving the APP centers around the preeminent release of a PATH caucus, the Psychedelic Assisted Therapies Caucus, formed by Congress through the Crenshaw Amendment, the first piece of federal legislation that really put federal dollars towards psychedelic research, helmed by one Dan Crenshaw and also by AOC. So the Crenshaw Amendment creates the PATH Caucus, and in August 2024, the PATH Caucus puts out a request to the public seeking expert information from from involved industry stakeholders, experts, advocacy leaders, etc., and then goes the additional step of creating a series of working groups in which, over the early course of 2025, a number of gatherings were had in Washington with, as I said, industry stakeholders, advocacy leaders, key lobbyists, representatives from pharmaceutical organizations, etc. This is what's called an RFI, a request for information. And all of the advice and counsel and input and recommendations and chitter chatter that goes into a PATH Caucus working group report is then compiled into a more efficient report and eventually distributed both to lawmakers and in turn the general public, outlining what these industry stakeholders and the relevant parties involved in Congress have to say about what some reasonable recommendations might be for federal psychedelic policy reform. Not unlike a task force, as we've covered and talked about earlier in this episode. Here's where it gets dicey. So the Association of Prescription Psychedelics and Mimi Walters stand essentially accused of getting their hands on some of this data. It's worth noting that they likely contributed to the RFI, given that they're at the forefront of this and are their membership comprises of almost every major psychedelic pharmaceutical company you can think of. They're essentially a trade group for psychedelic pharmaceutical companies, psychedelic biotech companies. So reasonably, you would expect that they would give some information for this RFI that would, be involved in the creation of these Path Caucus working groups. The allegation that's been made is that the Association of Prescription Psychedelics somehow managed, allegedly, to get their hands on the full working group report prior to its release, both to lawmakers and to the general public. How that happened, not really sure, but they're alleged to have done that and then used that data to host a series of private briefing sessions or listening sessions with relevant stakeholders at the, key government agencies, the VA, DEA, DOJ, et cetera, congressional staffers, and the allegation essentially is that they used this data, passed it off as if it was their own design and creation to curry favor with and potentially, gain influence over, in the offices of key bureaucratic stakeholders. We've talked a little bit before, Joe, about how a key focus of warring factions, if you will, in the race to psychedelic, policy reform here in DC, at the federal level, is who's going to get there first. That's one of the biggest concerns. It's not necessarily, how do we build the most cohesive coalition possible to advance the most collaborative and full-threaded framework? It's who's going to get there first. So any edge that you can get, presumably, really makes a lot of sense. So that allegation has been made, and a formal complaint was filed with the Office of Congressional Conduct. Some might wonder, why is Mimi Walters, a former member of Congress, subject to oversight by the OCC, which oversees current congressional activities and members of Congress? The general idea behind filing the complaint with the OCC, based on my conversations with the whistleblower who filed this report anonymously, to be clear, is that the OCC oversees the Path Caucus. So any misuse of taxpayer-funded data generated and compiled by the Path Caucus, would in theory be subject to OCC oversight. So that's part one of the allegations made. The second complaint was filed anonymously by a different whistleblower who leaked this complaint to me. Both were leaked to me exclusively for my reporting for Double Blind Magazine. The second complaint filed with the DOJ centers around Kyrsten Sinema, former Arizona senator, now heavily involved in lobbying efforts surrounding ibogaine policy reform at the state and federal level. What's notable is that Sinema, by appearing at a Senate roundtable event that was hosted here in DC back in December 9th of last year, as well as by speaking at a state hearing in Arizona last fall in support of ibogaine research legislation, appears to have violated what is, a mandatory 2-year cooling off period for former members of Congress in being involved in any lobbying activities, period, state, federal, whatever. Blanket 2-year cooling off period. Definitely something that plenty of people across the vast spectrum of the political realm are fairly fast and loose with. But this complaint comes at a perilous time for Sinema and for her credibility within psychedelic advocacy circles. Those who might be unfamiliar, she's also been recently subject to a lawsuit from the ex-wife of, I guess, her current or potentially former romantic partner, Matthew Amell, who is also an ibogaine advocate involved in advocacy efforts with Americans for Ibogaine, as well as, I believe a former patient at Ambio Life Sciences down in Tijuana, Mexico. They met because Amell was working for Sinema. They've been accused of having an affair, and she's been sued under an obscure North Carolina law known as the alienation of affection law, I should say. That led to the revelation of a number of things. We won't get into the dirty and sordid details. I highly recommend checking out coverage that already exists. However, it is worth noting that in the fallout from that lawsuit, Sinema was also accused recently of spending well over $700,000 in campaign funds after she'd actually left office. Campaign funds are often stored in a political action committee or organization, designed to support reelection efforts, kind of always raising money for that when you're in Congress. And there's often a lot left over. It can be distributed back to the, whatever national organization for them to use on other elections. You can give it to other candidates directly. You can't really just spend it on things, right? Unless it has something to do with actual politics and actual electoral politics. Sinema was found by the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan campaign finance watchdog group, to have spent I believe over $250,000, 300-something thousand dollars in just payments to former staff members, including thousands of dollars to Amel, her former bodyguard slash alleged affair partner. Not even alleged. She actually admitted to the affair recently in the latest court documents. So the most recent payment, and I think this is really worth noting, that was paid to Amel from her campaign finance fund was $9,000 last October. 9 months after Sinema left office, she's still allegedly, not even allegedly, these are things that are registered and filed with the necessary federal, you know, governing bodies. This is stuff that's on the record. This is how she spent the money, right? So whether or not it's legal seems to be up for interpretation from the federal government if they should so choose to investigate it. But on paper, it looks pretty sketchy. So why does all of this matter? I've rambled for 5 minutes about this now, so I will wrap it up in a neat bow. Why does all of this matter? Let's get to the heart of it. I have long said that the political arm of the psychedelic renaissance will be remembered as one of the most consequential political movements of the 21st century because of its interdisciplinary implications across any number of facets of society, bureaucracy, etc. And I think what we are witnessing in the broad scheme of psychedelic coalition building, both at the state and the federal level, is an unprecedented level of bipartisan investment and involvement in simply addressing the mental health crisis, the opioid crisis, any number of public health crises that are afflicting the American populace at large. And in the process, certain pragmatic decisions are being made that I think I really believe, closely mirror a lot of what has gone wrong in the decline in popularity of the Democratic Party at large on a national level over the last decade and a half in particular. And I think we're seeing a shift towards the invisible moderate position that's leading to being fast and loose with background checks on key and prominent political allies, and a lot of top-down decision-making that leads to both short-sighted policy, but also the co-optation of policy priorities to a select few upper echelon donor class of constituents, if you will. And that's why both this matters, because I believe fundamentally that anybody interested or invested in the future of mental health care in general should be tracking the politics of drug policy reform at large. And I believe the most important thing you can be is thoroughly informed about how these systems of change are being enacted. And then secondly, people who donate their time, their money, and their emotional support to these movements should be informed as to who the allies, the organizations they're dedicating their support to are really involved with. And I think regardless of whether or not someone might pass it off as needless infighting or highlighting of squabbles between internal faction parties, I think it's really important that people know who the organizations they're entrusting with the future of this multi-generationally consequential movement are really in bed with, in action, in allyship, and at times in direct financial and monetary exchange, right? So that, and it also leads to highlighting all the more the importance of what's happening in states like New Mexico and Massachusetts and Colorado, where a constituency is building out, a more democratized framework for how the underground economy there is actually operating in the confines of legal decriminalization of personal use and home cultivation. It's why highlighting the few pockets and examples of coalition building that sticks and leads to an enhancement of policy innovation, the development of the Treatment Equity Fund, the integration of indigenous practitioners and ceremonial offerings into the future framework of the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Program. All demands made reasonably by a concerted effort from grassroots coalition members that extend across the socioeconomic spectrum, that we find a pretty vast disparity in diversity when we talk about who's really backing psychedelic policy reform. So that is a hefty 9-minute monologue off the dome about why all of this matters. And I hope that we can get some great clips from that to really help inform folks, because it might seem like, oh, this might not go anywhere, so it doesn't matter. Even if the OCC doesn't move on this, even if the DOJ doesn't move on this, people that are interested or even invested in any way, whether it's at the local level, state, federal, a lobbyist or not, you're just somebody who gives $25 to an organization involved in one of these, many a scandal, at the end of every year because it's tax season or whatever it may be, you should be informed. and to decry that as highlighting little more than partisan squabbling and infighting, I think is short sighted, and dare I say, a bit manipulative of organizational constituencies. So, end of rant. We're a solid 10 minutes over. Joe, any other thoughts or comments or questions for me, or about all of the above?
No, let's just keep watching it and see how this plays out. I think it's important when federal and state investigators are looking at campaign spending and issues around lobbying. We should carefully pay attention and make sure we're doing the right thing with our attention and efforts and money. Because we want this thing to unfold with as much integrity as we can, and hopefully have the best result for the most amount of people.
Yeah. And on a closing note, like these, I've seen no evidence that these competing complaints have hindered or impeded progress at the federal level. I think that we're going to see some really, to tease a little bit of what I do know to be coming soon, we're going to see some really interesting progress at the federal level as far as psychedelic related innovation when it comes to policy. And I am confident that these scandals should be illuminatory for the reasons that I've laid out, but that they will not ultimately be a hindrance to progress in the immediate future, which is, I think, a hopeful note to end on. Anyways,
Absolutely.
Thank you to all who've tuned in. We're at 55 strong here, going on 41 minutes. My name is Jack Gorsline. This has been Psychedelic States of America's Monday News Roundup, and we'll see you again later this week. Take care, folks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.